We are in a series in the book of Philippians. We're in chapter 1. And we're reading verses 12 to 26. That's found on page 980 in your pew Bibles. Philippians chapter 1. If you have trouble finding these few epistles in Paul's writings, a very simple way to learn the order of Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, which I learned that through the Bible. Did anybody take through the Bible? That what they said, that the way to remember these verses is just remember Gentiles eat pork chops. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Gentiles eat pork chops. So that'll help you find your way around the New Testament. With that in mind, let us give our attention to God's holy word. I want you to know, brethren, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I will rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Christ Jesus, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with all courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. Thus far, the reading of God's holy word. Most of you know that my wife and I were missionaries in France. We were working among the Muslim population, the immigrants who lived in France, and we were on a missionary team, and we were brainstorming one morning about a certain event that we wanted to put on, and it was a rather ambitious event, and we started talking about all of the wonderful things that could happen and how well things could go if we were able to carry out this event the way we planned. And as we talked about what we could do this, and then we could do that, and this could happen, and that could happen, and it was as if we could conquer the world, that nothing could go wrong. And we were all excited about the possibilities of trying this new adventure that we were seeking to put into place. And then the person leading the discussion said, yeah, but what's the downside? What could go wrong? Well, we kind of looked around at each other and said, what could go wrong after the scenarios we've been painting? What could possibly go wrong? There was a silence, and someone said, what if we can't get the location that we want to meet in? People shrugged, said, yeah, that could happen. Someone said, if the weather's bad, that's not a good place to be because, and didn't think of that. Then someone else said, there are groups that don't get along with each other, and if we invite this group, that group may not particularly like it. And someone said, yeah, that could really be a problem. And then the downside started coming quicker and faster, and you could hear the excitement and the joy in that room begin to let out as air in a balloon, so that by the end of the meeting, we had a room of depressed, discouraged, and paralyzed people, thinking that the world was now about to come to an end. The book of Philippians is a book about joy and rejoicing. And the reason the book of Philippians is about joy and rejoicing is because Paul says there is no downside to the Christian life. There is no downside to the Christian life, and particularly in chapter 1, he lays out 3 reasons why we should rejoice in everything that happens. Those 3 reasons are, first, in Philippians chapter 1:6, we should rejoice because it is God's work that is being done in us. He began it, and He is going to complete it. Secondly, in verses 12 to 18, Paul points out that God is at work in all the circumstances of our lives, and that we should rejoice in whatever comes our way. And third, in verses 19 to 26, God is at work through us to advance His purposes in the world. God is at work in us, God is at work around us, and God is at work through us. And these are the reasons that Paul says there's no downside, and that the normative attitude for every Christian should be joy and rejoicing as we see God's plan unfolding in our lives and around us through everything that is taking place. Now, I need to hear that this morning. And so do you. Because I can tell you that my normative attitude in life is not joy and rejoicing. I am normally frustrated, angry, resentful, and worried. I don't think I'm alone. I don't think that you are much different than I am. And if truth be told about every one of us, we've never outgrown the terrible twos. Let's face it. In a world where there is a sovereign Lord who rules the universe, if your life is contrary to His will, you're not getting your way. And just like every 2-year-old who doesn't get their way, we want to scream and shout and be angry. But for those of us who have given our lives to Christ in response to what He has done in us, there is no downside to the Christian life, and joy and rejoicing should be the normative attitude of our life. Let's see how it works out in this passage. First of all, as we saw last week, it's Christ who has begun this work in our lives, and it's Christ who has at work in our lives to complete that work. And Paul says, as he writes to Philippians, I'm going to take joy in what I see God doing in your life. Now, does he say that because everything is wonderful in the church in Philippi, that this is the exemplary church, that there are no problems in this church? No. If you look at what he says to them, you see there are real problems in the church. Look at chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 with me for a moment. He says to them, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each one of you look out for the other to his own interest, but not to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Now, why is he writing that? Because there's rivalry in the church. There's problems, there's arguments, there's frustrations. You'll come right out in Philippians chapter 4, verse 21, and where he identifies 2 ladies, and he says to them to agree in the Lord. The church in Philippi is divided. And Paul could be discouraged, and he could say, what has happened to the church? There's also in that church probably people looking down on others. Well, that person just isn't as spiritual as I am. They haven't gotten as far along as I have. They're still struggling with issues that I don't have. And people were basically concerned about their own interests, their own problems. But Paul, instead of looking at what the Philippians lack, is rejoicing in what God has accomplished in their lives. Now, I want to tell you that the Christian life is a very long race. A very long race. And I've always wanted to run a marathon. In fact, several times in my life I've actually trained for it. But it seems that when I get to about 12 or 15 miles, an old foot injury comes back, and that's about all I can do. It's a very long race. And one thing I've noticed about me when I run, I don't know, maybe you don't do this, but I don't think about the number of miles that I have to go. I think about the number of miles that I've finished, about how far I've come. That's the first mile marker. That's the second mile marker. That's the third mile marker. I think about what has been accomplished. And this is not just simply seeing the glass as half full versus half empty or looking for the silver lining around the cloud. It's understanding that God is doing a work in our lives and that there's a lot more to be done. And if we look at what it needs to be done, we could be very depressed people. Particularly if we understand what God is calling us to. And sometimes we need to just pause and remember where we were, where we've come from, what God has accomplished in our life, what has truly changed, so that what comes out of our lives and becomes a motivation in our life is thankfulness and gratitude and joy. Now, what do you think is the best motivation for the hard work ahead? Gratitude, thanksgiving, and joy, knowing that certainty that the God who's brought you this far is going to help you get the rest of the way home. The rest of the way home. Any progress we make is not only is going to come through the work of God's Holy Spirit working in our lives. So we should rejoice in where we are, because God has done an amazing work to get us this far. Is there a lot and a more amazing work yet to be done? Absolutely. But the God who's brought us this far will finish the work that he has begun. Secondly, Paul says he's going to rejoice because of what he sees God doing in the circumstances around his life. He says, I'm rejoicing because, I see God doing things in and around me that is just amazing. Listen to what he says. This is my paraphrase of verses 12 and follows. He says, I want you to know, brethren, what's happening to me. It's all serving for the advancement of the gospel. He says this. Sorry, I went from page 4 to page 6. He says this. I'm in jail. I may die. People are causing me all kinds of trouble, but I'm thrilled and delighted. That's what he basically says in these verses. I'm in jail. I'm in change. I may die. People are causing me all kinds of trouble, and this is wonderful. This is wonderful. Now, why is that? You see, Paul was a servant of the Lord. And his greatest desire is to see God's will fulfilled in his life. Not to get what he wanted. Now, I believe that Paul happened to be in prison in Rome. If you know anything about the letter of the Philippians, if you've studied it at all, you know that where Paul is writing from is debated. The reason for that is that in the book of Philippians, there are several trips back and forth that are spoken about. The gift coming from Epaphroditus, news going back to the Philippian church that Epaphroditus is sick, news coming back to Paul, their response to that, Paul sending Epaphroditus back to Philippi, Timothy going back to Philippi, Paul going back to Philippi. If he's in Rome, there's just too many trips perhaps for all that to take place because travel was not an easy thing to do. So it's suggested that perhaps he's at Ephesus or perhaps he's at Caesarea. I happen to believe that he's in Rome because of the references to Caesar's household, the imperial guard, and the praetorium, and things like that. A technical kind of discussion that probably most of you aren't interested in. But there's the background for it. But Paul probably did not want to winter in Rome. If he had his choice, he would have taken his winter vacation in the southern Judean hill country where it was a nice place to pass the winter. But he's not living his life for himself. He's choosing to be a true servant of God, to do what he wants. And what's interesting is that his life is not guided, or his emotions are not guided by the circumstances of his life. Now, the truth of the matter is that most of us at best are secularists, are deists. That means we believe that what happens in our life is just random circumstances. Sometimes we're lucky. Sometimes we're very unlucky. But most of the time, it just is what it is and we're bored. It's kind of like this. If you've ever stood around a craps table, when the dice are hot, people are happy. They are thrilled. They are filled with joy and excitement. But as soon as the snake eyes gets rolled, there's no joy, there's no contentment, there's anger, there's frustration. You see, we live life as if there was no God, and the things that happen to us are just either good luck or bad luck or just the way things are, and our emotions ride this roller coaster of responding to those things that are happening in our lives. Paul did not live that way. Paul lived as a believer in the God of the Bible who is involved in every aspect and detail of everything that went on around him, and he knew that God's work was being fulfilled in him, so that even in the horrific circumstances of being in prison, having the penalty of death hanging over his head, he can still say, I'm going to rejoice, even when people were intending to do him evil. He said, there are people here who are preaching the gospel out of rivalry, out of the motivation to do me harm. I don't know how people do that, but Paul says people do that. He says, I don't care. All I know is God is going to take the evil and wrong motivations of those people and use them for his good. And so I'm going to rejoice in that. Now, don't we need a healthy dose of Paul's way of looking at the world? Particularly those of us who are Reformed. You know, the interesting thing about Reformed people is they say they believe in the sovereignty of God, but yet they don't live like it. They believe that, I've got to stop this, or I've got to do that, or God's purpose in the world is not going to advance unless I'm here to protect it or do it. No. God's will is being done. God's will is being carried out. And so Paul says, I can rejoice even in the most horrific set of circumstances. And he doesn't say this lightly. He doesn't say this without fear and trepidation or glibly. Listen to verse 20 in Philippians chapter 1. Because I believe in this verse, we're starting to hear some of the real, and I'll use the word fear in Paul. He said, it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed. He's worried that as the time gets closer and maybe he'll be tortured, maybe he'll be put to death in some way. We don't know. He says that I will not at all be put to shame. Is he worried about himself being shamed? No, he's worrying about the reputation of his Lord being shamed. And he says this, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. That's how difficult this situation is for Paul. But Paul can rejoice even in these horrific circumstances because he is not living life around his plans or his goals, but he's realized that he's built them around Christ's goals. And so what he says, I want you to know that these circumstances have turned out for the advancement of the gospel. For the advancement of the gospel. Now, why is he writing this to the Philippians? Is he telling them these things because he wants them to know what God is doing in his life? Sure. But he's using that as an example for them to understand how they are to interpret the circumstances that are going on in their lives. Because I am sure that the church in Philippi was passing through difficult times. Life was tough for Paul in Philippi. Remember, he was imprisoned, he was beaten, he was they wanted to throw him out of town, but they had to ask him to leave because he was a Roman citizen and they had mistreated him. And so I'm sure that the church in Philippi had struggles, as all the churches in that first century around the Mediterranean basin. And he's writing them and he's saying, look, if I can see the good in what God is doing through the horrific circumstances in my life, then you should be able to see the good in the situation that you presently find yourself in and rejoice. Now I want to share with you a truth that I've learned over my Christian life. God's purpose in my life is most advanced, and He is most glorified in my life when I have been in the most difficult set of circumstances. Let me repeat that. My experience in the Christian life is that God is most glorified and His purposes are most advanced in and through my life when I am in the midst of the most difficult set of circumstances. Haven't you found that same thing to be true? That God is most glorified when things are most difficult for you? I've told this story before. When I was in college, I was in the hospital for several weeks, observation of heart trouble. I don't have a heart trouble, at least not physical heart trouble. And I'm laying in bed and for a couple of weeks and not much to do, and God was able to really speak to my heart and life and did one of His works. He not only worked in my life, He worked in my friends' lives and the wider community's life. God really did a great thing through the difficulties that I was going through. Now, Paul isn't saying, I'm happy to be in prison. I'm happy to be under the condemnation of death and the fear of being martyred. No, he's saying, I'm delighted because God's kingdom is advancing and His purposes are being fulfilled. And even though you might be in difficult situations at this moment, you need to look for how God is using that to advance His kingdom. Now, it's clear that God is not the author of those circumstances. He is not the one who brings about evil, but He is the one who takes the mess that we find ourselves in and uses it for our good and His glory and the advancement of His purposes in the world. And Paul says, in that I will rejoice. I want to make a second point based upon that point. The story of Joseph in the Old Testament, the big meaning behind that story is basically the same. You know the story. Joseph is the first son of Rachel, is that correct? I think so. Look it up, I might be wrong. And the most beloved wife of Jacob. So he's the favorite child. He's got 11 other brothers. Would you like to have Joseph as a brother? No, you wouldn't. He was arrogant, obnoxious, and hard to live with. He was his dad's favorite. While the brothers were out watching sheep, he's at home relaxing. If it were today, he would get a car while everybody else was walking. But instead, he got the coat of many colors. And then he has these dreams that he talks about how God is going to exalt him and how all of them are going to be bowing down before him. He was obnoxious. That's why his brothers planned to kill him. But instead of simply killing him, they said, look, if we kill him, what good is that? Let's at least sell him and get something out of him. Because he's worthless to us, dead or alive. So they sell him into slavery. Paul. Who are we talking about? Joseph. Joseph is the servant of Potiphar. Because he won't sleep with Potiphar's wife, she makes up a story about him. He's now in jail. And then the story turns. You know the story. And he becomes second in command in all of Egypt. There's a great famine in the land. He's prepared for it by interpreting God's dreams. And he brings his family down. It's not quite that easy a story. Hope you're reading through it in your daily Bible reading. And his family is there. And his father, Jacob, dies. so the brothers come to him and they say, before Dad died, he got us together and he told us that you should not take revenge on us for all the evil that we did for you. He wanted you to know that. Jacob does this very godly thing. He says this: you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, so that many peoples might be saved. Now, the interesting thing about that story is Jacob didn't say, you meant it for evil, but it really turned out good for me. No, his life had been hell for an awful long time. He said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, for the advancement of his purposes. Now I want to talk to you. I want you to listen to this. I know that every person in here has had evil done to them. If you're lucky, it's not too horrific. Some of you have had things done to you that are unspeakable. And I apologize for bringing this up, because I know that no matter how long ago it was, it's still an open wound. But I want to tell you this: that great evil done to you will become, in God's plan, the very centerpiece of the way he is going to use you and advance his plan through you for his kingdom. I'm not saying what was done was good. It was not. I'm not saying you should not hate what was done to you. You should. But what you should hold on to and what you should believe is the God who made the universe is so ordaining everything that comes to pass, weaving it together for our good and his glory, so that we can in all things give thanks to him. And whether we can see it now clearly or whether we look through a mirror dimly, we will rejoice in what God has done. We will rejoice in what God has done. Third, notice that Paul says that he expects God to work through him. He expects God to work through him, and he will rejoice in that. He will rejoice in that. Verses 19 to 26. And this is where at the beginning of the letter Paul calls himself a servant. Now, a servant is someone who is not concerned about his own desires and his own agenda, but the agenda of his master. And nowhere does Paul prove to be a servant more than he does in this passage, because he basically says to the Philippians, I've got two choices here. And what's interesting, if you're reading this passage, there's a lot of double entendre going on. There's change and imprisonment, there's advancement, there's affliction, there is deliverance. Is he talking about being delivered from prison, or is he talking about being delivered from this earthly life and going into the presence of God in heaven? What is exactly he's talking about? He's kind of playing on all of these images in this passage. But what he's saying is, things are really hard here for me, and I want to leave this world behind, and I want to go and be with Jesus. That's what I want more than anything else. I want to be with Christ. But he says, my life isn't about what I want. It's about what's going to please Christ. And so he says, I'm going to stay on here. And I'm going to stay on here because of what my life is going to mean for all of you. And he says, and I know that I will have fruitful labor because of that. Now, there's a couple things that I think we should look at. The first is this. There's a lot of question about what happens to someone when they die, a believer. What happens to their soul? The church has, over the decades and years, said different things. There are those who believe that when a believer dies, you go to purgatory. You wait till the final judgment. There are others who believe that the soul sleeps. You are put in a state of suspended animation, and when you wake up, you're standing before God in the last judgment, and no matter whether it's been 1 day or 1,000 days, you have no awareness from the moment you died until the moment you are awakened at the last judgment. Does Paul sound like he's wanting to take a nap? Does Paul sound like he's going to a place where he's going to kind of be in a waiting room, waiting is it my turn yet? No. He wants to be with Jesus. He wants to physically be in his presence. He wants Jesus to come up to him and wrap his arms around him and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." You see, for Paul, there's only one thing better than serving Christ, and that was being with Christ. And he says, I want that. But I don't call the shots. I'm a servant. And so I'm going to submit to the will of my Father. And I think what that's going to mean, it's going to mean my deliverance. It's going to mean that I'm going to have the opportunity to come to you again, and that my life is going to be fruitful. Now, I wonder if you think that about yourself. That God's plan is for your life to be fruitful, to have an impact, to transform others, to make a difference, to count for something. That's what being a Christian is all about. That's God working in and through us. That we are part of the eternal works of God, and that what He does through us will last forever. And in that we will... Thank you. Rejoice. And in that, the normative position of our lives will be joy. Because God is at work in us. Because God is at work in all the circumstances around us. Because God's desire is to work through us. In and through all things. And so Paul says, for me to live is Christ. But to die is gain. He had that assurance that if death were to come today, he would stand in the presence of his Lord. I normally assume that most people that come to Crescent Valley Church are believers. That they have that assurance, and they know why. That when they die, they will immediately go into the presence of the Lord. That may be a mistake. There may be someone here today, there may be many people here today, who do not know what will happen to them if they die. Do not know where they will be. If you're in that position, would you speak to me after the service, or one of our elders, or would you call me this week? Because I'd love to sit down with you and walk you through the assurance that Paul had, and how you too can say, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For Paul to live as Christ is because he lives to serve him. For Paul to live as Christ is that he lives to advance Christ's kingdoms. That's how his life is summarized. That is his deepest motivation and desire. And I ask you, is it your deepest motivation and desire as well? If it is, then you can rejoice. Because it's just God working out his plan of salvation in your life. Because what God has done, what God has started, he will finish, and we will rejoice. What God is doing around us through all the circumstances of our life, will we rejoice. And the fact that God works through us